So today we have Christian Peukert, who I know for quite a while, and nowadays he is in Lausanne at the HEC. He received his master's or Master of Business Research in 2013 from LMU Munich, and in 2000. Oh, that cannot be. I think I copied that wrongly. So it must be probably 2017 that you finished your PhD, or is it 2014?
I think it's 14, yes. So the
Okay.
Master of Business Research is basically the PhD program.
Okay,
so that's why it's so short after each other.
Okay, so you indeed finished your PhD just 1 year after finishing the Master of Business Research, also at LMU Munich. And then you had a very stiff career in a sense that you first have been a senior research associate at the chair for entrepreneurship at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. You then in 2017 became an assistant professor of information systems and management at the Católica in Lisboa in Portugal. Thereafter, you have been a senior research associate at ETH Zurich at the Center for Law and Economics in Switzerland. And I think this is also how we first met, right? In terms of law and economics research. And then we did both something else and worked more on data and privacy issues and stuff like that. And so I was very excited about your recent research. And nowadays, you're also the director of the PhD program in management and an associate professor at the HEC Lausanne in Switzerland. And it's always nice to see that rising scholars are very successful, and you have published just this year in Nature, 2022, so that is very cool. And you also have publications in marketing science and management science. And today you will talk about Facebook shadow profiles. And we are very excited about the topic and your talk. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lars. Way too many warm words that I don't really deserve. Thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for taking the time to join the call. Very grateful to have the opportunity to present this project here. It's a project that I'm very excited about, something that we've spent quite some work lately. And when I say we, who I really mean is Luis Agros at Zurich, Max Schäfer at Yale, and Hannes Ulrich at Copenhagen and DIW. And Hannes is also here to answer all the difficult questions for me. So some of what I will share today is quite preliminary. So any thoughts on data, additional results that you might want to see, or the positioning of the paper are extremely welcome. And then please do interrupt me at any time. I'm happy to take questions as we go. All right, so let me start by motivating the big picture. So regulation of digital markets has been recently become a top issue for policymakers, and data protection is just one of the cornerstones, not only in the European Union with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which came into force in 2018, but also other jurisdictions are catching up with the strict rules, and you know, California is just the most recent high-profile example. And of course, most recently, meaning like a couple of weeks ago, the draft of the Digital Markets Act of the European Union was passed, and that will bring new rules, especially for big tech firms. And you know, this broader regulatory efforts have been preceded by specific antitrust cases and investigations. In late October 2020, Department of Justice brought an antitrust case against Google. The acquisition of the sports tech firm Fitbit was subject to a quite heated debate in Europe before it was finally cleared. And then, you know, all kinds of actions happening. A little more than a year ago, the European Commission announced that they will file charges against Amazon. And then, of course, very fitting to today's paper, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. There's this case of the German Antitrust Authority filed against Facebook, which has been sort of in the works in the German legal system since 2019. And you know, what's sort of the common ground for all of these cases is that they are largely about data and potential abuse of dominance in the collection and usage of data. And in the particular case of the Bundeskartellamt, the German antitrust authority, is that that the argumentation is really that they do not only base their court filing on antitrust, meaning competition grounds, which, you know, as the name suggests, they should be doing, but to a large extent also on consumer protection, meaning privacy grounds. I think this is a very exciting field to be in these days, because you kind of see the lines blurring more and more between sort of consumer protection and competition policy. So, okay, so that's kind of the broader picture that sort of this paper lives in. But I wanted to also talk a little bit more about why we choose to study one of the big tech firms, and sort of clarify the second part of the title. So what are shadow profiles? Shadow profiles denote personal information that can be constructed either without permission or without the knowledge of a person who's being profiled, and who might not be about users or persons that might not even be users of the firm that builds the profiles, or a user that doesn't agree to the terms of the firm that builds the profile. And an early example of shadow profiles, sort of where it first was brought to public attention, was a bug that on Facebook that was leaked in 2013, where people started to understand that by uploading your contact list from your mobile phone, you're actually supplying data to Facebook about users that at some point might become users of Facebook, but are currently not. And so what this really helped Facebook to do was to understand the offline social networks or off-platform social networks of people. So they knew that, you know, some Lars is in my phone book, and so we might be we are connected, we might be friends, and then Facebook used this information in order to suggest Lars as a friend on the platform to me. And there's actually some evidence published in Science Advances in 2017, which uses data from a different social network, which is Friendster. I don't know how many of you remember this. This is even before MySpace, way before Facebook. That shows that offline social network information that sort of portrays the relationships between users and non-users of that social network can actually predict stuff that's very privacy relevant, like sexual orientation or relationship status of non-users. Now, what's interesting about this discussion about shadow profiles is that it's often discussed in the context of privacy. So information that you might not want to share, and that someone else sort of contributes to some kind of firm, and then they can infer some of the things that you might not want to share with the firm, but not very often. So far, there's been a discussion about shadow profiles in the economics of privacy. So the actual business models of firms, and I haven't seen a paper that tries to get at an estimation of the value of the data that can be used to produce these shadow profiles. The peak of the public discussion of shadow profiles in the Facebook case was probably in April 2018, when Zuckerberg was questioned by Congress, and a week later also by the European Parliament. And quite interestingly, he avoided questions about shadow profiles, saying that he didn't know about them and needed to get back to his engineering team. And now for you, the good news, and maybe also for Mark, the good news is that we can actually provide an answer in our paper. So even if he doesn't know after reading our paper, he might know that at least potentially Facebook could make shadow profiles, and then we'll also attempt an estimate of the economic value of the underlying data here. And this brings me to the research question that we want to study in this paper. We'll focus on one particular mechanism by which Facebook can make shadow profiles, which is like in share buttons. And you might wonder, how does this work? So it's fairly simple, but don't worry, I'll talk more about this in just a second. For the like and share buttons that you see on so many websites, Facebook can actually know whether you visited a website, and how long you stayed on the website, what you did on that website, and so on. And because these like and share buttons are distributed on so many different websites, Facebook can actually have a network that follows your web browsing. And there's basically three questions that we want to tackle in this setting. First, so first order question is how much of an individual's browsing activity can actually be monitored by Facebook using that like share button tracking technology. And then the nice thing is that we can actually also distinguish between people that are most likely Facebook users and people who are most likely not Facebook users. And then we're going to look into some heterogeneity by different user types based on different demographics or different interests as revealed by the types of websites that they're visiting. And then lastly, we'll also try to. Yes.
Why would you use social plugins? I'm probably not technically the most advanced person, but I'm wondering whether, like cookies or log files or something like that might be of even more interest, because they might potentially allow you to directly see which other browser windows you have open and so on, instead of having this social plugins.
So you're exactly right. So I'll have a couple of slides on that, but the short answer is really by displaying a like or share button, Facebook actually sends a cookie that is then stored on your PC. And so the next time you go to a different website that also has a like and share button, the cookie sort of it checks whether you already have a cookie, and then they can make the connection that it's actually you who also visited this other website before. And so it's really the underlying technology is really cookies. And of course, the like and share buttons have this dual function that is sort of the part that we explore here in this paper is the tracking network, the technology that it gives to Facebook. But of course, there's also a ton of other reasons why they exist and why they actually might be helpful for consumers, why they might be helpful for websites and so on. But I'll have more details on this in just a second. So the third question that we want to tackle is basically we want to estimate how valuable is this data to Facebook, and then we're basically sort of attempting to sort of reverse engineer prediction technology that Facebook might use in order to come up with these user profiles. Basically convert the information that you visited this website and that other website, and how they can use this information in order to figure out whether you're male or female, whether you're old or young, how rich you are, and so on. All right, so more technical details. Let me talk a bit about web tracking and how this technology works. So let me start with a cartoon that appeared in the New Yorker in 1993. This is from the early days when people envisioned the internet as sort of the ultimate medium of free speech and expression, when people were fascinated by how easy it is to connect to the world while still hiding behind an anonymous IP address. And this was, of course, before the internet became commercialized. So it's probably no longer true that nobody knows that you're a dog online. What's really happening is with the commercial internet, and by commercial internet, what I really mean is the ad-supported internet, that there's all kinds of tracking technologies that make sure that the industry, the advertising ecosystem actually knows who you are. So let me just illustrate this with a little stylized kind of framework. So we started with the consumer, and this consumer is interested in the contents that a publisher offers, and there are also advertisers that are interested in exposing their products to interested consumers. And then there's an ad network that basically forms a platform that connects advertisers to publishers, and that therefore also advertisers to consumers. And they have this sort of central structure that are sort of in between the advertiser side and the consumer side. And this is really where the nobody knows you're a dog idea falls apart, because there's a whole industry that tries to measure consumer preferences to help targeting, to sort of help to make sure that the advertisers find the right eyeballs to serve their ads to. And these, I call them loosely trackers. Other words exist for that. What they do is they basically either help advertisers directly or indirectly through ad networks. The idea is that trackers basically follow consumers around the web, try to figure out what are the things that a consumer might be interested in. They then aggregate that information and then usually sell some kind of profile to advertisers. And then, of course, this all happens within milliseconds. As you navigate to the website, there's often a real-time auction where different advertisers bid for your attention. And in this process, all these third parties, what I loosely call trackers here, sort of also step in and sort of tell you as an advertiser, who is this person? What's this person likely to buy? What are the preferences based on the data that they have collected? So these trackers really predict consumer preferences with data on behavior. It doesn't have to be exclusively web behavior, sort of the things that you look at online, but all kinds of other information, even from offline sources and so on. All right, so in this world, everything is connected to everything, and it's clear that sort of nobody's really anonymous online. So now, what we want to do in this here is basically look at one particular firm, one particular technology that sort of sits in this box that I loosely call trackers, and try to understand sort of how can they collect this data on behavior, and in particular now web browsing behavior, and then in the next step figure out sort of how valuable is this data in order to make the consumer profiles. Now, a big company that's if you look at sort of the reach of their tracking technology is actually Facebook. This is how Facebook pitches their tracking network to consumers. So this is a press release from 2015 where they say, we sometimes hear from people that the ads they see aren't as useful or relevant to them as they could be. And then Facebook is very nice. They say we introduced online interest-based advertising that helps to solve this problem. And so what online interest-based advertising really means is that they're taking into consideration what you're looking at online, and that includes what you're looking at outside of the Facebook platform. Right? And the way this works, I've already talked a little bit about this, is actually through their network of like and share buttons. So here, here's an example, a screenshot that I took yesterday from which I think is the local Bremen newspaper, and you see a share button in action. So if I click here, I'm going to be redirected to Facebook, and then I can directly share that news article with my friends on Facebook. Let's dive into more detail to really understand why would Weserkurier put this Facebook button here, and then also why would Facebook offer this technology to Weserkurier in the first place. So these so-called social plugins have been around for quite some while now. So introduced in 2010. Basically, it's a set of scripts that are very easy for website owners to implement into the website. And what happens is you sort of see a button appear, and when a user clicks on a button, then a link to the content is directly placed to the user's Facebook profile page, which of course then makes it visible to the user's friends. And then by some measure, Facebook is going to determine who's going to see this content. So why would content providers, why would websites install these kinds of plugins? Well, social recommendations have been shown that to be an effective measure to increase traffic. And it's no surprise then that a lot of content providers relatively fastly adopted this technology. So in a study in 2012, which is only 2 years after the technology has been introduced, already 22% of the top 10,000 websites actually do have a Facebook social plugin. If you look at more recent data, the numbers are way higher. Now, what's in for Facebook? Well, first of all, the buttons increase usage of Facebook's social network website in the first place. There's more content. So if I know that my friends will post things that I find interesting, and it's easy for my friends to post stuff that I find interesting, then I'm also more likely to go and go to Facebook and spend time on Facebook. It also creates valuable first-degree information about preferences of users. So if I click and share a Visa Courier article, then Facebook knows that I'm interested in local news from Bremen, and that's of course valuable for targeted and personalized advertising. So it's for them it's also a way to sort of reach beyond their boundaries and understand what is the content that I'm interested in. Now, the second degree effect is actually the one that we care most about in this paper, which is that Facebook can actually collect data about browsing activities of users using these social plugins. And as I already mentioned, so every time a Facebook button, a like, share, and also these login kind of functionalities are loaded, you're basically communicating with one of Facebook's servers, which then will send a cookie to be stored on your local machine. And then the next time you interact with Facebook servers to load another like, share button, the cookie is going to refresh. And by this, Facebook can sort of collect different data points around the websites in which you sort of like and share buttons. So you can really think of this as the cookie stores date and time of your visit, and also from which environment your visit was initiated. So Facebook would now know that yesterday I was visiting Visa Courier. I clicked it because I clicked on the link, but also the interesting part is I didn't even have to click on the link for Facebook to know that, because they immediately sent the cookie as I'm visiting the website. And that's the crucial part. Tracking via like and share buttons actually works for any user. So independent of actually clicking the button, just the fact that the button is loaded means that there's some communication between my local machine and Facebook servers. And then, of course, also independent of having a Facebook account. This works for anyone. So go back to that screenshot. I don't have a Twitter account, then loading this image that communicates with Twitter servers would work as well as if I had a Twitter account. Same with Facebook and all these other technologies here.
Maybe one other question.
Yeah.
So would that mean that the cookie is locally stored on your computer, or does it mean that it's stored on a server somewhere in the web?
It's stored on your computer. That's sort of the definition of a cookie is always that it's connected to your device. But every time you communicate again with the server that sent your cookie, the server will also store the information that's that's in your cookie. So it's basically a server would store when you have received the cookie in the first place, and then it would store every time they see you again, and by seeing you again, meaning that that cookie is still stored on your local machine.
Okay, so if I delete the cookie, or like if I erase my cookie information, the data will be deleted on my machine, but a server somewhere on the web might still have information about me browsing the internet, right?
Right. Yes, for sure. For sure, this information will stay on that server. The question is whether when you get a new cookie, whether it's possible to know that you are still the same Lars, because you might have a new cookie ID. And there's all kinds of, this is $1 billion industry. So there's all kinds of research going and development going on to figure out how can we match different cookie IDs. And then one of the things they do, they call this browser fingerprinting, is they basically compare, all the information that your computer sends out about your operating system, about your screen resolution, about the status of your battery in your laptop, all these, your keyboard layout, all these kind of information. These are all data points that are, if you have enough of them, it's fairly easy to uniquely identify the same machine again. The one thing that they're not very good at is tracking you across devices. You can also try to track across devices if you realize that it's similar browsing behavior from the same IP address, and so it's not you using your laptop, but it's you using your smartphone. Maybe you log into a website using the same email address. You always leave some kind of crumbs that they can put together and sort of bake a new type cookie with all of this. Does that make sense?
Perfectly, yeah. Thanks.
All right. So, so the magic really is that this works independent of you clicking the button. It's enough that you see it, and it's independent of actually having a Facebook account. And that's pretty interesting because as you randomly navigate to a website, you have no way of knowing whether there will be a Facebook button, there will be a Twitter button, Pinterest button. And so of course, there's many companies that do this kind of, that have this kind of tracking technology. But for now, let's focus on Facebook. So there's no way for you to know whether that website will have a Facebook button before it's actually loaded. And ironically, there's actually also a tracking button on the news article about shadow profiles. I don't know if you've recognized that earlier. So it's very vastly diffused across many websites. All right, so the next question you might wonder about is, why would Facebook want to track users that are not currently users of Facebook? And there's a couple of reasons. First is the more data you have, the more accurate predictions of certain types of user characteristics you can make. And of course, you need some kind of outcome variable that you can observe. Some things are just inherently difficult to observe just from your browsing behavior, like your gender. So you always need to infer that from the sort of the types of websites that you're visiting. But other things might be much more directly included in the information can be stored in a cookie. For example, whether you have a Mac or a Windows machine, which people have shown to be correlated to income, and that's interesting information for advertisers. So if you just have more data to make these predictions, see what Mac users are interested in terms of different websites, then that's great. So you want to sort of just try to have a bigger sample and also regularly update that sample to make more accurate predictions. A bigger sample could also help to make better content recommendations. So even if some users that you observe through the cookies are not directly on Facebook, Facebook can use the browsing behavior of off-platform non-users and compare that to the browsing behavior of on-platform Facebook users, see what are things that they have in common, what are things that they currently do not have in common, and then recommend that stuff. That's kind of the recommendations you usually get on Amazon, where it says people who bought this also bought that. Here that's also helpful to make recommendations on the platform based on data of users who are off the platform. And then, of course, you can predict missing data points about demographics, for example, about the stuff that advertisers care about, income, your employment status, your interests, and so on, and sell that data or sell the information that you distilled from that data to the out-of-platform advertising network that Facebook also runs. That's also an important detail that maybe you're not aware of. So of course, most of Facebook's advertising business runs within Facebook, and of course within Instagram and all the other businesses that they have. But they also have an advertising network that runs outside of the Facebook platform, where they're basically just the central entity that connects advertisers to consumers and providing a service to the content providers. So this happens mostly in the mobile ecosystem. Often when you download these free apps, it's very annoying. You get all these ads on the bottom of your screen, and there's a good chance that these ads are actually served by Facebook. All right, and then the last reason is, of course, once you sign up for an account and you sort of use the same machine, sort of the same, still you haven't deleted your cookies, then Facebook can use the browsing data to directly display targeted ads and potentially personalized ads. And so that's a big head start for them. So for a new user, they don't need to learn about the preferences of the new user right away, but they already know stuff based on your history before you actually joined Facebook. All right. So remember when I motivated this, and this is my last slide before I actually get into the data. I talked a bit about the Bundeskartellamt case, where I said that it's currently pending in the German court system, and I wanted to quickly tell you where it is pending, what's the status of this, and then second, I wanted to give you a quick summary of sort of what the Bundeskartellamt says is the case. So they announced the investigation in December 2017. And then the investigation ended in February 2019 with the Bundeskartellamt prohibiting Facebook from combining user data from different sources. So that includes the stuff that I'm talking about, but that also includes data from different services like WhatsApp and Instagram and so on. And then since then, of course, Facebook appealed, and there were several court decisions two at the higher regional court, I think in Düsseldorf, and then the German Federal Court of Justice also had a decision, sent it back to the higher regional court, and the latest decision is that the higher regional court actually made some suggestions to the European Court of Justice, and now the European Court of Justice needs to decide about the bigger picture type questions. And they are mostly not so much related to Facebook, but more related to, can a competition authority actually file a case based on consumer protection based on privacy issues. Okay, so that's that. So I think it's very interesting because it also, you know, provides, once this thing is finally settled, I think it will have huge implications for regulation and for enforcement of regulation in the future in the entire European Union, I guess. So what is the Bundeskartellamt's case actually? So they have this theory of harm of Facebook reaching beyond its boundaries for consumers, advertisers, and Facebook's competitors. So for consumers, it's mostly a data protection issue where they say, you know, it's not really clear whether Facebook really has consent of users to collect data, and whether that constitutes a violation of privacy regulations. You know, and that has to do with the fact that, you know, you don't really know that Facebook is collecting your browsing behavior as you just randomly browsing through the web. And of course, you might recognize these little like and share buttons, but as according to the Bundeskartellamt, the majority of consumers might not be aware that there's actually data being collected. They might implicitly give consent because there's sort of a banner that says we have all kinds of cookies, but nobody reads this, and it's not really clear whether it's really informed consent. Second part about advertisers. If Facebook uses all these different sources of data that come from outside of the platform, and the tracking network is potentially one of the biggest sources of outside data, then Facebook can improve its targeting beyond what its competitors can do, and therefore sort of prices on the advertiser side would increase, Facebook become more dominant, and sort of by using their dominance in the social networking market, they can actually persuade many website owners to place these buttons, and as a side effect, they get more data, and therefore, with more data, sort of improve their competitive position, such that advertisers are actually worse off. And similar logic is with respect to Facebook's competitors, this idea of data network effects. By using this additional data, Facebook just becomes better and better. All these recommendations, all the targeted advertising just becomes much more interesting for consumers. And this provides, so that the additional data provides an unfair advantage to Facebook due to these data network effects, where, you know, more data makes recommendations better, which allows more people to come, which generates more data, and so on. So that's essentially the idea of the Bundeskartellamt case. All right, enough boring stuff. Now let's look into the data. So we have basically two sets of data that we look at. The first is we need to know what people are looking at online in order to figure out how much of this can actually be monitored by Facebook. So how do we know this? We have access to individual level so-called clickstream data that lets us observe the entire browsing history of 5,000 consumers in the US for an entire year. So we know every visit to any website that they make, and we also know how long they stay on the website. So this is basically peak surveillance we know everything that that people are doing online. And where does this data come from? It comes from a plugin that's installed on the user's device, which runs entirely in the background. So you sign up for this service once, and then you can immediately forget about it. It doesn't bother you, and just collects everything that you do. So it's essentially like a cookie that exists on any website that you visit. It's permanently stored on your computer, and it just tracks everything that you do online. So why would people do that? They get money for it. So it's a market research firm, Nielsen, one of the biggest market research firms, that incentivizes people to take part in this program. And so there's a relatively small amount of money that you get, and then they have a lottery every other month or so to incentivize people to stay in the program. And that, of course, questions whether people who take part in this program are representative of the general population. And so from a set of papers that have used this data, by the way, there's like a gazillion papers that use this kind of data, we know that the users are somewhat representative of the population of users, of people in a country with internet access. But we also know that they may be less concerned about privacy. In addition to their browsing behavior, so observing every click that they make, we'll also have demographic information about those users, and this basically comes from a survey that you fill in when you sign up for the service in the first place. And so they make you ask you questions about your age, gender, household size, household income, education, unemployment, these kinds of things. And then we borrow a measure of privacy sensitivity from this Goldthorpe and Tucker paper, where they say if someone does not reveal their income in a survey, it's a measure of they are more privacy concerned than someone who does reveal their income. And this is also how we know that these people may be less concerned about privacy, because we look at sort of what's the share of people that do not reveal their income in our data compared to the share of people that do not reveal their income in the Goldthorpe and Tucker paper. And so the share is much lower. It's about 2% versus 15% in the Goldthorpe and Tucker paper. So bear that in mind. But in the end, what's more important for us than people's privacy preferences is really that sort of the browsing behavior is not different compared to people that wouldn't take part in this kind of Nielsen data collection effort. And we don't know that, but it remains the best data source that you can get for these kinds of questions. Okay. So think of this as kind of the ground truth. So we know everything that these 5,000 users do for an entire year, and we know their age, gender, and so on. Of course, these are stated information, but as long as they're not lying, then that's the ground truth of the demographics and also on of their user behavior. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to define users of Facebook versus non-users of Facebook. And so the easiest way to think about this is someone who never visits facebook.com in an entire year, not even once, is probably someone who doesn't have a Facebook account, or maybe they have a Facebook account, but they don't care too much about Facebook because they never visit once in 12 months. And then accordingly, someone who visits Facebook once in a 12-month period is a Facebook user. And then we have different thresholds that we play around with. Okay, second part of the data, how do we know whether a website has a like button? Turns out that this is actually fairly easy to do. So you basically just look at the HTML source code of a website. Here's an example, TechCrunch, it's a tech news website. And then if you look at the HTML code, you see all the scripts that are executed, and then here's the Facebook one. It's an iframe that points to some kind of PHP script, and we know that this stuff is pointing to Facebook.com, so it's that's the tracker that we're interested in. You see, there's all kinds of other stuff in this example. So Facebook is by far not the only company that uses these kinds of technologies. But for the sake of this paper, we only care about Facebook. Now we match the browsing behavior data to this kind of data that tells us whether Facebook is able to monitor the traffic that goes to a domain. Using historical HTTP requests. So it's a fancy word for just saying, this is the stuff that you can see in the source code. And that comes from a project that is called the HTTP archive. Some of you might have heard about the Wayback Machine, where you can look at archived versions of websites. Think of the HTTP archive as basically archived versions of the HTML code of websites. It's a bit more than that, but think of it in this way. And then out of the almost 500K websites that are visited throughout this entire year by these 5,000 people in our data, we can roughly match 110K in this HTTP archive, because of course they're not archiving each and every website. But it turns out that they cover the most important ones, the ones that account for 25% of visits and sort of 75% of visits and almost 90% of browsing time. So though it sounds like a big number of 500 versus 110, actually the ones that are not covered in HTTP archive are also not the most important ones. We also take that into consideration and estimate some Mansky bounds in our results. Any questions on this? Good. All right, so then let me dive into the results. How much of a consumer's web browsing can Facebook track? That's the first order question that we want to answer here. Before we go there, I wanted to show you a plot where we can see the browsing time in hours. So how much time do people spend on Facebook? How much time do they spend outside of Facebook? And then the time that they spend outside of on Facebook, we make this distinction whether this is stuff that can be tracked by Facebook. So websites that do have this like or share button, and stuff that cannot be tracked by Facebook. So websites that do not have these like or share buttons. And then this is just broken down by different user characteristics. So male, female, unemployed, and so age, brackets, and so on. And you see that people spend a crazy amount of time on Facebook. That's all the blue bars. But of course, they spend much more time not on Facebook. But still, it's quite stunning. Facebook is just one website. And then there's these 500K other websites. And so maybe a third of the time is actually spent on Facebook. So this is 2016. I don't know whether people are still spending so much time on Facebook, but I found that quite stunning. And you'll see that Facebook is also able to track quite a bit of the browsing activities of these users. Okay, quite a bit actually means about 50% of your browsing activity. So what I'm showing you here is averages for overall. That's the 52%. That's kind of the same thing as I already showed you in the other picture. And now I'm making an additional split by people who never show up on Facebook.com in our entire observation period of 1 year, and people that show up at least once on Facebook.com. And you'll see that for the Facebook users, the share is actually a bit higher, 55%, and for the non-Facebook users, it's 44, slightly lower, but still quite a substantial share of the browsing behavior. Now we can break this down. Last year, the question.
Yeah, can you say something about what browsing history means or browsing time means? Because when I open my PC, what I usually do, I open like 10 or 20 windows all in one browser, and then, you know, I work on a text or Word file, and then the windows are open, but I'm not looking at them. And maybe I have like BBC World News in the background, but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we don't know exactly how Nielsen measures the time spent on a website, but we did some tests. So we looked at all the YouTube links that that people have clicked on, and then looked at how long are the videos, and you get a very strong correlation in the time measure that Nielsen gives us and the actual length of the YouTube video. So what you described could be happening, but I think they have some kind of timeout, and they also apparently they also know whether sort of which website is in focus, and they only sort of count the one that's in focus. But it's a very good question. I tried very hard to get more insights, but you know, you can't. They won't give you this detail. The salesperson that you can talk to, they usually have no clue about the technology, and then I guess if you would be able to talk to someone who has a clue about the technology, they would lie to you because you know, it might not be as great as they sell it to you. So with all these caveats, you know, it's the best type of data that we can get, but I'm not 100% sure whether this is all the best data quality. But you know, high correlation in terms of, you know, for stuff where we know how long people would spend, as a high correlation between the measure that we get and how long they should spend on a website. Okay. And I'll always make a distinction between browsing activity, which is the share of websites, you know, just the number of domains, and the share of the number of domains that Facebook has a plugin installed on, versus the browsing time, which is just counting, you know, adding up all the seconds that you spend on an individual website. So what you're looking at here is just the number of domains. It doesn't use any of the time information. The reason why we sometimes use the time information is because on Facebook, next time you go on Facebook, observe the URL bar in your browser. It doesn't change. So when you click something, it will always say facebook.com. And so we can't distinguish between, so one click on in our data, one click on Facebook can actually be spending hours on Facebook and clicking on all kinds of stuff within the Facebook page. On other websites, if you go to Visa Courier and you click on different articles, your URL will change all the time. And so that's sort of the clicks measure that we get from other websites is much more precise than from Facebook. And therefore, for some of the things where we really want to compare sort of the usage intensity on Facebook versus other websites, then we have to go with this browsing time measure, because that's the only thing that we can observe for Facebook as well. All right, so 50% roughly, a bit less for the non-users. And then the other part that I wanted to show you here is we split this up by quintiles of basically usage intensity. So these are the people that use the internet the least. These are the people that use the internet the most. And then the pink ones are the non-Facebook users, blue are the Facebook users. These are confidence bands, and so you'll see that they'll always overlap. And so for the ones that use the internet the least, sort of the share is lower, but there's not really a difference between Facebook users and non-Facebook users. And for the ones that use the internet the most, also the share is higher, which makes sense. You know, as you surf more actively, chances that you encounter websites that have Facebook buttons is also higher. The second piece of information that I want to convey on this slide is that once you start to control for usage intensity, sort of these differences really go away, and Facebook can basically indiscriminately monitor the non-users and their own users. This is the same picture, just a different measure. That's the browsing time thing that we just talked about. Again, different quintiles by browsing intensity. In terms of the browsing time, sort of your overall mean is 40%. Facebook uses 41, 38. There's no difference, significant difference between Facebook and non-Facebook users once you control for the time. So really the takeaway here is once you control for usage intensity, Facebook can track the Facebook users as well as the non-Facebook users to a similar amount, which is about roughly 50% of the stuff that you look at online, measured in domains and measured in terms of time that you spend there. All right, next analysis is looking at different users based on their demographic characteristics. So this is gender, male, female, employed, yes or no, age brackets, whether you have higher education, whether you're privacy concerned. Remember, this is the measure. Someone doesn't reveal their income in the survey, so then we call them privacy sensitive. If people reveal their income, we call them non-privacy sensitive. And so what you see here is again the same picture. About 50% of your activity is tracked by Facebook. And again, you see so much overlap in the confidence bands between Facebook users and non-Facebook users. So really indiscriminate tracking ability, even within Facebook versus non-Facebook users according to different demographic groups. So what this is to say is that essentially, you can try to not have anything to do with Facebook, but they still, there's no way you cannot escape being tracked to a similar amount as if you were really heavily using Facebook and sort of drawing some kind of value from that. Lars, you had a question.
Yeah, and maybe just a statistical comment. So I'm not quite sure if the confidence bands do not overlap, whether they might still not be different from each other statistically. So if they do not overlap, I think then for sure there's a statistical difference. But if they do overlap, I think if you run a statistical test, they might still be statistically significant.
Yeah, I think so. So I think we ran all these. So these are just the illustrations. I think we ran all the more fancy stuff in the background. I'm pretty confident about these results.
Just to make sure that potentially you might have a result, and now you're just stating that it's not there, so it might actually support your research in a sense. Yeah. No. This is a great point.
For the sake of presentation, I try to keep it as simple as possible. But we looked into all of that. And there's also, this is all a lower bound because of the fact that we cannot really observe whether Facebook trackers are on, not for all of the domains that are visited by our users. We know whether there's a Facebook button or not because it's not covered in the HTTP archive. And so all of what I'm saying here is essentially a lower bound. All right, same for browsing time tracked. So that's not very interesting. And then we can do that also by website category. So categories that might be more privacy sensitive, like adult stuff, dating, gambling, government, health websites, and so on. Stuff where you file your taxes. Stuff that might be more revealing about your financial status and so on. So for the most part, we don't really see a difference between these Facebook users versus non-Facebook users. And you can, of course, understand that there's some information in observing if someone is looking at the career development website about what they might be interested in terms of ads, gambling, and these kind of things. And then another thing that we did is we also looked at competing platforms. So platforms that do stuff that Facebook does, like enabling you to communicate with others, like sending emails, instant messaging, websites that have similar social networking capabilities and competing in a broader sense, that it's also enabling you to find content online, sort of websites that have are search engines and so on. And here what's interesting, so every time it's red underlined, it basically means that there's a statistical difference between the Facebook users and the non-users. Here, what you often see when you look at the competing platforms is actually that sort of the non-Facebook users are less well tracked by Facebook than not. And I think this is also not very surprising if you think about sort of the incentives that you have as a competing platform to sort of share data about your users with Facebook. It's of course a double-edged sword, sort of depends on sort of whether you want to free write on the installed base of Facebook or not. So you actually, even if you're competing, you might want to have access to Facebook's social network because of its sheer size. But at some point you don't want to have access to it anymore. All right. So I'm already quite a bit over time, but I still wanted to share a bit more results, if I may, which I think are super interesting. That's stuff that we that Hannes mostly has been working on in the last couple of days, which is currently not part of the working paper draft that we have out there, and that is trying to figure out what can Facebook actually do with this data, and so we have these self-reported demographic information about each user in the Nielsen data, gender, geographical location, this kind of stuff that I just showed you. And of course, these are valuable data points for advertisers that never directly observe this in web browsing behavior. For example, gender or whether you have children and so on. That's never a direct information that they can get. But actually, this is a screenshot from Facebook. If you want to run an ad, then you can actually select on these on many of these demographics. So that's stuff that advertisers really care about, and that's the product that Facebook offers to advertisers. You want to target people of all genders, aged between 18 and 32, who have this level of education. And so how does Facebook know this stuff? It knows it from observing what you do on Facebook and from observing what you do outside of Facebook, and then sort of running this through prediction models and then sort of putting people into these boxes. Okay, and so for some users, they know this because people reveal their gender, they reveal their birthday, they reveal whether they have children or not to Facebook on the Facebook platform. But for other people, they don't have this information because they only observe the browsing behavior outside of the Facebook platform. The question is now, can Facebook use the outside browsing behavior data to train a model on predicting gender, predicting education level, predicting age, and so on, in order to also have this data for the people that don't provide the information directly to Facebook, for the non-users. All right. So our idea here is that we know for Facebook users, we know the demographic outcomes and the out-of-platform browsing behavior. And so, as I said, Facebook can predict the demographic outcomes of non-Facebook users using this outside browsing data. And as well, we also know the demographic outcomes and how much out-of-platform browsing behavior Facebook can observe. So we can actually sort of reverse engineer Facebook's model of predicting the outcomes of non-Facebook users, and then understand sort of how valuable is the browsing history to make these user profiles. And we do that by comparing the prediction quality for Facebook users to the prediction quality of non-Facebook users, and then sort of can quantify the value of shadow profiles. So the way you do this is we built a state-of-the-art machine learning model to understand how well Facebook can predict demographic outcomes using the out-of-platform browsing data. And the way you can think of this is basically a big matrix where you have demographic outcomes, like, just as an example, gender, and then 50,000 columns that give you the number of visits that a particular user has made to a particular website. So this user is female, has been 121 times at the NewYorkTimes.com, 0 times on ESPN, and 654 times on YouTube. So it's basically a matrix that has 50,000 columns and 5,000 rows. Okay. And then we run this through a classifier model, which is XGBoost, extreme gradient boosting, which is kind of the state of the art of how you would solve these kinds of problems, and then also apply automated hyperparameter tuning, because there are some parameters that you need to set yourself, and that's sort of we'll basically run this a couple of times and then figure out what are the optimal parameters to get the best predictions. What do I mean by best predictions? I'm not sure whether you've seen this before. This is an ROC curve, receiver operator characteristic. So it's basically a plot of so how often do you get it right versus how often do you get it wrong. And then a random classifier would be somewhere in the middle. So 50% of the times you would get it right, 50% of the times you get it wrong. A perfect classifier would look like this. You always get it right. And then any model would be somewhere in the middle. So this is the blue model that is better than random, and here's a green, a yellow model that is better than the blue model, but not as good as the perfect classifier. And so the way you can interpret this is basically by looking at sort of the area under a particular curve, and the further out the curves are, the better are the predictions. And then the way you can compare across different models is by simply just looking at the area under the curve. So this the blue part here compared to the area under the yellow curve, and then you have some kind of quantification of which model is better. And by model, I mean different parameters, and I also mean different data inputs. So the nice thing here, really, doesn't matter whether the model is better. It can be completely different algorithms that produce these classifications, completely different data. It's really just a very nice, easy to understand method of understanding, okay, this is a better prediction than another prediction. So this area under the curve, AOC, is going to be our measure of how well do the predictions actually work. All right, so that's that. And these are the results. So we basically look at predictions of where we use the data, where we train the model on the outcomes that we observe. Outcomes are all of these different outcomes here. Say, let's look at this. This is a child, someone that's between 0 and 18 years old, and they are Facebook users. And so we train this based on the subsample of Facebook users and understand, sort of using all the information about the browsing history, how well can we predict this outcome. And turns out pretty well. So the area under the curve is pretty close to 1. So 1 is the theoretical maximum. 0.5, that's this one, that's random chance. So that works pretty well. And then if you use this trained model in order to make predictions about the non-Facebook users, basically assuming that we wouldn't know their demographic outcomes, then the prediction is worse, but it's still much better than a random guess. So if you take the average across all of these different categories, then you'll see that the pink bars are about 14% worse, but still about 20% better than random guess. So what does this mean? Well, there is some value in this data that Facebook can collect through the like and share buttons. So you can actually make meaningful shadow profiles, meaningful in the sense that these shadow profiles are more accurate than just randomly guessing whether you have children in the household, whether you're male or female. But it works better for Facebook users than for non-Facebook users. And the underlying reason, I think, is because the non-Facebook users, first of all, the group is smaller. A lot of people have Facebook accounts in our data. And also the non-Facebook users tend to be less active internet users. And so there's just less information for our model to work with. All right, so let me conclude here. So we do three things in this paper. First, we describe the extent of internet activity monitoring by Facebook. I'm not saying that they do this. I'm saying they could do this. We still don't know whether they are doing it. So when I earlier said that I have some good news for you and also for Mark Zuckerberg, still don't know whether they are doing it, but they can do it. And they can track 50% of the browsing activity, 40% of the online activity in terms of time. And this is independently true for whether you are a Facebook user or not, and independently true based on your demographics and interest based on the types of websites that you look at. Second, I just very quickly showed you some of the early results that we have on characterizing the value of shadow profiles. Which basically tells you that Facebook can use this information from your browsing history to make meaningful predictions about user demographics, which again are valuable inputs for advertisers. And those are about 40% worse than those of Facebook users, but again, reasonably well or reasonably better than just random guesses. So there is some information in this shadow profile data. If you want to take the definition of shadow profile to the narrowest case, it's a profile of someone who doesn't even value Facebook enough to make one visit within a 12-month period. And then lastly, I think I spent almost too much time on in the motivation talking about sort of why this is relevant for policy. I think we're more and more experiencing sort of this intersection between privacy policy and competition policy, and sort of all kinds of efforts to bring the two together. So I think we're adding a bit of empirical evidence to that, and then of course there's this special investigation by the Bundeskartellamt where sort of this might be actually quite helpful. Although I guess now it's just a legal battle anymore, so nobody really wants to look at the empirical evidence, I guess. All right, so I think that's all I have. I'll be happy to answer any further questions or receive comments via email, or you can just also write me on Twitter. Thanks so much for your questions and for taking the time to listen to me.